Hello, Namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is weekly talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. This talk show features guests from different walk of life, and we discuss on various issues that impacting Indigenous peoples worldwide. And we try to build connections between the Indigenous communities and share the lesson learned, especially from the guests from different countries. This talk show, in this talk show, sometimes we do online interviews, sometimes face-to-face interviews and so forth, and even to discuss on very contemporary issues about the Indigenous peoples. I have invited very renowned guest, especially from Indonesia. She is by profession a lawyer coming from Indigenous community, and herself she describes as a defense lawyer. And she is also associated with association of lawyers, defense lawyers, Indigenous people's rights defense or some, they named as Pepe Aman.
Pepe Man.
Pepe Man. So as I briefly described about my guest, let me first welcome Surti Handayani.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show first.
Thank you so much, Deb.
So Surti, for the first time, I think this is not your first time to Nepal, but as you said that this is your third time, but for the first time that we met each other, and then I really was following your work in Indonesia, especially defending Indigenous people's rights. So could you briefly introduce yourself and your organization, especially defending the rights, the role of your organization, please?
Yeah, thank you, Dev. My name is Surti Handayani. I belong to Osing Indigenous Peoples Community, based in the east corner of Java Islands, nearby Bali. And I'm also involved with the Indigenous Peoples' Right Defenders Associations in Indonesia. This organization have members from lawyer and also law expert to help and dedicated our times to Indigenous peoples through the archipelago. Thank you.
I see. So as we are in Nepal, we also have organizations founded by lawyers, and there are a lot of issues about the human right defenders. Actually, this human right defenders, the term has been so fashioned. Yeah. In a way to attract the donors, or also to do advocacy in the international level as well. So as you named your organization itself as the defenders of the lawyers or defenders of Indigenous people's rights, right? Mm-hmm. Could you briefly tell the work that how the Indigenous people's right defenders in Indonesia actually work? And especially in raising awareness of the Indigenous people's rights in the ground, or defending the Indigenous people's rights in the ground, please.
Okay. Basically, our mandate as a organization or Indigenous people's lawyer organization, we're doing not only litigations ways, but we also doing for non-litigations to support and strengthening the Indigenous peoples in Indonesia. Because Indigenous peoples, they live in so far from accessibilities, and we're really difficult to have any information while they have a conflict. That's our task, to help assignment on court trial, collecting any information, any data, to collecting and then to creating the draft before we going to the court trial. So in litigation ways, we always use law, legal impact effect or any regulations in Indonesia, but in non-litigation ways, how we to strengthen the Indigenous peoples, we're doing is like training for paralegal, to strengthening the youth in communities, because we also need youth as frontliners to bringing up any information to us as a lawyer, because it's really gap. We are stay in the city and the community stay very far. There is no net connection sometimes. They has no any information. So we doing training for paralegal as our frontliners and bringing up any information and support us as data.
I see.
The other things for the non-litigation ways, we also doing some of strengthening to indigenous peoples, to transferring any legal aspect and regulations in Indonesia to the community. Use our own words or make a simple any document words, because when we read any legal aspect or legal regulation, etc., this is really difficult to absorb by the community. So we try to make more simple and simplify the method, the act or bill, etc., to transfer the community, to raising their awareness, because they protect their customary lands. This is what we are doing in Pepeman, but we also sometimes not going to court trial, but we receive any complaint about conflict from indigenous communities. If that's not really critical to assign, we give legal opinion or advise the community what they have to do, something like that.
Good. So earlier you used one word, that indigenous peoples do not have access to justice, as you said,
Yes,
right? The one
yes,
word.
yes.
So in that is also similar status in Nepal as well.
Yeah.
As the situation in Nepal and Indonesia, I think, is not much different, though the Indonesia is the island country. Perhaps in comparison with Nepal and Indonesia, Indonesia is far more developed than Nepal. But the indigenous peoples who are staying in the grassroots. So in your opinion, what are some of the barriers for indigenous peoples to access the justice or access the existing justice delivery mechanism?
The obstacles is recognition from the state to indigenous peoples as an identity. That's the problem. We always face challenges to appearance indigenous people existence during the court trials processes, because the judge somehow they have to require really tricky requirement to indigenous peoples as principals. You can show your legal entity as indigenous peoples. This is indigenous peoples. They know about anything about legal, no? And if you say this customary land belong to you, you have to show indigenous forest legal permit from Minister of Forest in Indonesia. If you want to show those aspects as evidence, legal regulations or local regulations to indigenous protecting and recognitions, and also indigenous forest legal permit, it takes a long time. But the conflict still going on, For example, in one of community in Indonesia, they process about local regulations for indigenous people's rights and protections, recognition and protection. It takes around 5 years
to get the justice.
To get the justice.
Okay.
If they have a good engagement with the government.
I see. That means if they have a connection with the government officials.
Yes.
Only if. If they don't
Only
have,
if.
it will take longer.
Yeah. Until now, they're still invisible in front of our governments. For examples like we called Ohangana Manyawa, indigenous peoples who decided to voluntarily isolate it in North Maluku. There was no maiden, because this indigenous knowledge to capturing, to manage their customary land, to doing plantations, to harvesting herbal, etc., to hunted animals to feed themselves by their own indigenous knowledge. But during the governments pointed those areas as the investment for nickel mining, they're facing a lot of problem. Now, since 2019 until 2022, we assist around maybe 10 indigenous peoples accused by life sentences and death penalty sentences. So that's why they decided to uncontacted with outsiders, because while they're contacted with outsiders, they have to be facing any displacement suggestions or disease or criminalize.
I see.
That's
So-
still, yeah.
So I'm also closely following the issues of the indigenous peoples in Indonesia, but
Yeah.
then because of the diversity in terms of the language, diversity in terms of the race, and so forth, it has been really tricky, and the government itself is not favoring or supporting or recognizing indigenous peoples as such in Indonesia. As you rightly mentioned that nickel mining is one of the example, and Indonesia actually falls under the rainforest area, I guess. So there is a lot of the global corporations which are investing
Yes.
in the conservation, in the name of conservation, in the name of mining, as you said. What other the must challenges? What are some of the must challenges that indigenous communities are facing besides this? The issue of displacement in the name of mining and conservations. What other issues that indigenous peoples in Indonesia are facing, and how, as a lawyer, you are just helping them?
The other challenges for indigenous peoples is knowledge, formal knowledge, access to has proper educations, and also access to have health properly. They're still challenging because the access to reach out the community also still lack to facilitate it from.
Is it because of the because of the geography, or
Yes.
because of the transportations?
Yes, and also because the languages.
Ah,
Because sometimes the government only use our own bahasa,
Bahasa Indonesia.
bahasa Indonesia, to has a communicated with indigenous peoples.
Uh-huh.
But the indigenous peoples, they only use their own mother language. They couldn't speak bahasa, and sometimes they come to the community without any translator. So that's why indigenous people always fail to negotiate with the government when they come, and somehow they're cheating to the community. They come only for the discussion, but they come to bring any investment. So this is the critical points for us, because when the government is coming to the community without any consent, because they didn't know about the bahasa, and they decided, oh okay, they're signing any registration,
Whatever they bring,
whatever they
without
bring,
knowing.
without knowing, without any FPIC processes, no?
Okay.
And now, when they realize the government's coming to the community and they're signing registration, it's become to the big investment. They're getting, the government betray us.
True. But then the Indonesia government has acknowledged the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
Acknowledged, but not a party to ILO Convention 169. But that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples guarantees indigenous people's right to land,
Yes.
territories, and so forth,
Sure.
right? But then that is not happening in the ground.
No,
Right?
not happening in the ground. They denial about indigenous people's identity.
Existence itself.
Yes.
Okay. So as you brought the issue of, very important, the issue that you brought, that right to information in the mother tongue is necessary, as you
Yes.
said. But many international laws, as being a lawyer, Universal Declaration on the Rights of, Universal Declaration on Human Rights,
Yes.
or ICCPR, or ICESCR. Your country, Indonesia country, is also party or member to the United Nations, like
And
in Nepal,
ratified also.
and ratified also the
Yeah.
ICCPR and ICSCR. Article 19 actually guarantees right to information, right? Actually, right to information.
Yeah.
But these all international laws actually do not guarantee right to information in mother tongue. To what extent do you think the right to information alone is not going to address the indigenous people's issues, right?
They only respect to their own law.
Mm-hmm.
They signing any United Nations declarations, international conventions. They also ratified them, but they never respect it. They
That means
never
in-
implement. Even we are, as a lawyer, when assigned the indigenous people, we bringing up any international convention, any UN declaration inside the draft, inside the document. But the judge only respect our own national regulations, That's why what PP Man doing to teach law enforcement officers, to teach our judge, to teach our we call it, Supreme Court, Constitutional Court. We're bringing up any international convention, UN also, to teach them about indigenous people's identity. Because when we try to fight back the government, this always failed. They said like, no, here's no one from indigenous peoples. They not exist. They already use any modern things, like they use handphone, they wear properly. We said that this is really Western capture to identify indigenous peoples in Indonesia. Should us as indigenous peoples only naked like before? We can use any modern things, because this is really dynamic. We have to adapt, and we have to, not following, but we have to enjoying the rule about the modern ways as indigenous peoples. This is what the pragmatism ways, because if not, we already disappears. Disappear as identities, and we could be disappear as indigenous peoples persons if we try to, combat or fight with our governments.
True, that's true. You really brought that issue, that when there was negotiations which was taking place, when the ILO, International Labour Organization, actually adopted ILO Convention number 107 back in 1957. Afterward, there was also, a kind of global discussion about the assimilation of indigenous peoples. So therefore, the ILO had to amend and introduce the ILO Convention 169.
Yeah.
As you rightly said, that indigenous peoples, right? The perspective into looking of indigenous peoples is really different.
Yeah.
But then there is a need for indigenous lawyers like you and us to raise awareness and so forth. As you said in background to me, is that you provide the legal aid to the indigenous peoples on the ground. How important it is to provide legal aid to the communities. Why we need to, create a kind of mechanism to increase the access to the communities. Why it is important, or how is it possible to provide that kinds of legal aid in a country, such a diverse country like Indonesia or Nepal,
Yeah, it's supposed to do, because if they're not aware about this, about their own securities actually, while they do protecting or protest, so we have to reach out any legal aid to indigenous peoples, because they couldn't reach out us who live in the city. Like what I told before, we live very far from the indigenous people. So the legal aid is supposed to bringing down to the community. It's supposed to be grounded to the community.
But it must be very expensive, or it must be time consuming. It must be challenging in terms of language, in terms of finance.
Yeah, but
how are you managing this?
As a lawyer, I know lawyer pro bono, we has no money. But we try to work collaboratively with the organizations like Aman. Aman also has some money, and our mandate to assign any litigation and non-litigation waste to Aman members. So we receive any support from Aman to reach out the community, to bringing down any legal aid to the community. But we also work with another organizations like IPP also. We work collaboratively with also IPNI and also Indigenous People's Rights Initiative and Accountability Council and also local NGOs.
So from that experience, that means one person as an individual or one organization as a single alone cannot do anything. We have to collaborate, right?
Indeed.
So what other strategies that you actually apply in order to raise awareness, legal awareness, especially rights-related awareness to the communities at the ground? Besides this, building out, a kind of alliances or allies with other, like-minded organizations, what other strategies actually help?
We built some of information centers
Okay.
at the community. For the example, we built information centers in Pocoleo. Pocoleo is one of indigenous people's community at East Nusa Tenggara impacted by energy transitions in the name of renewable energy. There has no any internet connection, there has no any electricity, so we support the community with information center, and we support them with satellite to have any information and to give any newly or an update of information situations in the community.
So that means that in that information center, you also use the audiovisual, media and the print and so forth, or what kinds of the information center? What does it comprise with?
This like the information centers managed by youth in the community. They collecting, or sometimes the community gatherings this to the information centers to have net connections, and while they have a protest or conflict or chaos in the community, they're spreading to any social media to have any solidarity.
I see. The social media is one of the.
This more important to amplifying indigenous people's movement.
But many indigenous peoples do not even have access to internet or the social media.
Yes.
And also a capacity to use them, how to best utilize them, or other audiovisual, the material and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So, when we talk about, as you are the lawyer, and we journalists often hear that many indigenous peoples are losing their land, they are losing their resources, they are losing their territories, and there is a lot of conflict which is going on in the ground. As a lawyer, could you tell us some of the reason how the indigenous peoples actually are forced to lose their territory, land or resources on the ground, and what do you think are some of the best ways to protect their land actually?
This is really difficult to to answer. How to suggest or the indigenous people's best way to protect, but these small things, but it's work. Indigenous schools to transfer any knowledge, not only from the modern knowledge, but also from the elders, indigenous knowledge. No? Because our youth, when they going to formal school, they only focus on those modern theory, etc. If they're not wise to study during studies, it become enemies to the community.
Good that you brought. You said that indigenous schools, and there is difference between the modern schools, as you said.
Yes.
The kids actually go to the schools, that is the modern system.
Yes.
As you said that indigenous education, what does that mean? Indigenous schools, indigenous education, how does that work in Indonesia? What is actually
in my
that education?
My own community actually, me and also my colleagues from other communities, as Osing community, we decided to develop indigenous school because we really worried about our next generations. They will lose any cultural knowledge, historical knowledge, and proud as indigenous peoples. Because I've been experienced since I was as a student. I'm really ashamed to recognize as indigenous peoples.
Why?
Because they have been long time stereotype to my community, as Osing community. But after I met some of anthropologist, he was a professor and doing dissertation about our historical. They said, you have to be proud as Osing because you have a huge history and very phenomenal history. It was, I'm still youth at that time. That's time 2010, and I realized, this is what outsider bringing up to our community. And we are ashamed to recognize as indigenous peoples at that time. And since that things, and try to raising awareness about this next generations, we created indigenous schools to teach them some our cultural stories, our ritual, our history, dancing, music, and also any plantation for ritual. We teach them to the not only youth but also to small kids.
And that worked
It
nicely.
works. It works. They said I'm really proud when I only once a year coming to my community during ceremony or ritual, and if I met with the students from Indigenous school, I met with the facilitator. So why you really interested to joining this Indigenous school? If not us as Osing, so who Ibu, they call Ibu. So who will protect our language, mother language? Who will use any dancings, traditional dancings? And also, who will protect our community? You're getting older. It's supposed to our times as a youth, as a next generation. That's make me proud with our team as a facilitator who developed this Indigenous school. He said, this is the point.
So that means that Indigenous school, which is not registered as a school, as a modern schools, but
Informal
that is
school.
informal,
Yeah.
informal spaces where
Yeah.
community members actually gather, that discuss about their rights and so forth. Have other communities also learned to develop such schools, or only in your town or in your country
No,
you have
in-
only a couple, or you are influenced from outsiders, like in Australia or in New Zealand, what they call is education nest, a kind informal group.
Actually, I'm influenced from Indigenous schools in South Sulawesi, who created by Aman at that time, and then I try to adapt and bring to my own community. But in Aman, they also have in around 98 or 100 more
Such
indigenous.
schools.
Yes,
Wow.
through the archipelago to support indigenous peoples who live in the remote area.
I see. So I think in Nepal also one of the messages that we can replicate or learn. So I just request you just share if there are any Facebook links of that indigenous schools and so forth,
Yeah,
so that
yeah.
other indigenous communities from different parts also learn from that one. So I have so many issues to talk, but then because of this time limitations, we cannot discuss a lot. But I don't want to ask you any questions. But then at last, I would like to give you an opportunity to share anything that you want to tell, or perhaps you want to give a kind of message to the viewers or indigenous brothers and sisters in Nepal, message from Indonesia perhaps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deb. My message to indigenous people's brother and sister here in Nepal, we have a same situation like in Indonesia. We still find any challenges as an indigenous people's identity, but keep fighting, keep moving, and be yourself as indigenous peoples. Be proud as indigenous peoples here in Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you, Surti. I'm really impressed that, let us not stay idle. At least do something that actually bring a positive message to the community. Thank you for that message, and also thank you so much for joining us at the Indigenous Television.
You're welcome. Thank you for this opportunity.
Today in Dave's Hammer Show, I had a very renowned lawyer, especially from Indonesia and the indigenous community, as she worked as a defense lawyer, providing a legal aid or pro bono services for many indigenous communities in Indonesia. There is so much to learn from her work and her organization, in fact. So just like this, I hope that for last half an hour, you learned a lot from her experiences. And especially, I'm really impressed with the indigenous schools that she brought that concept. Perhaps we also can introduce for that one. So with that said, we have come to the end of the show, but that doesn't mean the communication has stopped. You still can reach us if you have any feedbacks or queries regarding the program or television itself at indigenoustelevision@gmail.com. Next week, I will come up with new guests to discuss on new issues or with new contemporary issues. By then, have a nice weekend. Keep watching Indigenous Television and ITV Nepal. Thank you. Namaste.